Hello, and welcome to How to Use the Readiness Checklist workshop. This workshop is designed for districts to be able to understand how they can use the Readiness Checklist and the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide in order to determine if their chosen cohort is correct for them, and to be able to craft questions and next steps based on the success criteria on the Readiness Checklist. This is our meeting agenda for today. We're going to begin with a welcoming and an opening, move into some context and cohort overview, followed by some work time in which I'll model how to use the Cohort Readiness Self-Assessment Guide, and we'll end with some practice and gratitude. The Readiness Checklist is something that we are familiar with. We have used the Readiness Checklist before, but we have made some adaptations which will be discussed in this presentation. To get us ready and to get our brains flowing thinking about the Readiness Checklist and the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide, let's consider this question. How are you currently using the Readiness Checklist? There is not one correct response here, but there are many. So I ask that you take a moment, pause this presentation, and truly reflect. How are you currently using the Readiness Checklist in your district? And if you are not currently using it, how do you think that it's going to be helpful when you do start using it? Again, feel free to pause this presentation and press play once you are prepared to move forward. There are two very important components of TIA that we wanted to discuss, and that is our mission and our goal. As we think about the teacher incentive allotment and how to use the Readiness Checklist and the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide, we have to connect this to the bigger mission of TIA, which is to recruit, retain, and have an equitable distribution of highly effective teachers in the areas where they're most needed across the state. TIA's main goal is to assist in this process by making sure that there is a criteria for what is considered a highly effective teacher and for how this process can be implemented at the district level. We're now going to move into some context which will help to set the stage for our work time later with the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide and the Readiness Checklist. Here you see two versions of the Readiness Checklist. On the left, there is the old version of the Readiness Checklist, and on the right, there is the newer version of the Readiness Checklist. I do want to note that the updated Readiness Checklist that you see was made available in early November when the Cohort D application and scoring rubric were made available as well. So if you have the updated Readiness Checklist, which is available on our website, we'll also have it available underneath this presentation, which is listed on our website, then that is the new Readiness Checklist that we are referring to. So as we examine these two versions, I want us to note that on the right, in the new version, there are some changes and some adaptations that we've made to ensure that the process of applying for TIA is a lot smoother. These are our objectives for our time together. Feel free to listen as I read them, or pause this to read and reflect on your own. The first objective is to understand the purpose of using the Readiness Checklist and the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide, and understand why they have changed. The second objective is to use the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide to identify a district's current level of readiness. And the last objective is to use the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide to craft questions and next steps for a district. The idea here is to give a foundational understanding of the Readiness Checklist and the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide to be able to create questions and next steps to ensure that a district is implementing the success criteria in order to give their application the best possible chance. As we examine these 4 key vocabulary terms, Readiness Checklist, Readiness Self-Assessment Guide, Success Criteria, and Statute, let's take a moment to answer 2 questions. Looking at the first 2 definitions, Readiness Checklist and Readiness Self-Assessment Guide, let's answer, what is the difference between the Readiness Checklist and the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide? In order for you to have think time, feel free to pause this presentation and have some moments to reflect. The next 2 definitions for success criteria and statute, we're going to ask ourselves, why are these important? Again, feel free to pause this recording to have some time to reflect. When you are ready to proceed, press play. Now that we are back together, I'm just going to give you an example answer for each of those questions. The Readiness Checklist and the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide are different because the Readiness Checklist is a list of best practices beyond what is required in statute, whereas the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide is taking that list of best practice to help you in crafting next steps that make your system even stronger. The success criteria and the statute are important key vocabulary terms because they each let us know what is required, that is statute, what TEA sets forth as rule according to the legislature. And the success criteria is important because it helps you to understand the best practices that would make your system stronger. Each of these key terms are important in a foundational understanding of how to use the Readiness Checklist and the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide. As noted in the previous slides, each of these documents, both the Readiness Checklist and the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide, have clear purposes. The purpose of the Readiness Checklist is to provide a list of best practices beyond what is required in statute that would make your local teacher designation system as strong as possible. If districts were to include the best practices listed in this document, it would give their system the best chance at being successful. This slide was shown earlier to clarify when the new Readiness Checklist was made available. But in this slide and the following slides, you will see changes that were made to the Readiness Checklist and the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide. These changes were made based on feedback that we received from many of you, many of our district partners and our ESC partners. So we thank you for being our partners in this work and helping us to make our systems, including our documents, even stronger so that all of our districts are successful. There were changes made to both the Readiness Checklist and the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide that were pertaining to the format. As noted earlier, many of the changes came from our district and ESC partners. However, we also had some changes that came based on our wonderful new teammate, our communications specialist, who's been helping us with our branding here on the TIA team. So many of the new colors and the new order that you see came from many of our teammates' creative ideas. Also, you'll notice that the length is a little bit different for the Readiness Checklist. That's because we wanted to ensure that we include all necessary information up front so that when you access this document, you're able to be as successful as possible in creating your local teacher designation system. You'll notice that there are not only formatting and branding changes to the readiness checklist, but there are also changes to its content. For example, there are some categories that have been added, and there are others that have combined, so that this document is as clear and straightforward as possible. In Success Factor 2, which is now System Development and Stakeholder Engagement, it combined the previous Communication tab with the System Development tab in order for us to best support districts in their understanding of stakeholder engagement best practices. Similar to some tabs being combined, there were also entirely new success factors that were added. For example, the rationale and the weighting success factor tabs were added to the teacher incentive allotment readiness checklist. Part of the reason for this was to create some symmetry between the readiness checklist and the revised Cohort D application. However, we also wanted to provide districts with an opportunity to set the stage for what their application would require and need in order to be successful. There were some clarity points that were considered as well for the readiness checklist content. For example, we wanted to make sure that we added questions or moments in our success criteria that would allow districts to reflect on their response. So we shifted from having foundational guidance to having more of a direct response, letting districts know exactly what they needed to do in each success factor in order to be successful. Previously, we've spoken about the purpose of the readiness checklist. However, there's also a purpose to the readiness self-assessment guide. One of the main purposes of the readiness self-assessment guide is to provide a formative self-check so that districts can assess their own level of readiness. Using this document will allow for districts to have clear next steps in order to give their system and their application the best possible chance. Thank you again to our partners for their feedback regarding changes made to the readiness self-assessment. As you can see here, there is on the left the old readiness self-assessment version, and on the right is the new readiness self-assessment version. We will review what these changes are and how these changes are going to be used to strengthen your local teacher designation system. The changes that were made to the readiness self-assessment came in two formats. One was by format, which is the structure of the readiness self-assessment guide, and the other was by the content of the readiness self-assessment guide. Similar to with the readiness checklist, the readiness self-assessment guide had a significant branding change, in part because of our wonderful new addition to our team who handles communication and our branding and ensuring that we're aligned across our team and also across the agency. There were also some formatting changes regarding the length. So the reason why this document is a little bit longer is because we provided more clarity in each of the success criteria. Another important change to note is that we consolidated what was short-term and long-term goals, and we just put next steps. The reason why we wanted to make this change is so that districts have very clear next steps that they feel is manageable to accomplish in each of the key practices. Just as there were formatting changes made, there were also changes made to content. For example, as previously noted, the length is longer. However, the reason why the length is longer is because we wanted to provide more detail up front so that we can ensure that we give districts all of the information they need in order to create strong local teacher designation systems. We also wanted our key practices to be aligned to the TIA mission. So there were some wording changes in our key practices to ensure that the goal and the mission of TIA are interwoven throughout the entire Readiness Self-Assessment Guide. In addition, there were some links that were included in the new version of the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide. So if you access it online, you can actually click on hyperlinks. For example, Texas SLO is a hyperlink that you can click on in order to access more information on the new and revised SLO process. Now, bringing it all together, there are some similarities and some differences between the Readiness Checklist and the Readiness Self-Assessment. Let's start by looking at the differences. The Readiness Checklist, it details best practices within the success criteria. So each of the success factors has success criteria that lists best practices for what a district can do to make their local teacher designation system strong. And also, the Readiness Checklist can be used so that before there's any TIA-related work completed. So it can serve as a guide for districts to determine if their desired cohort is one in which they're ready for. The Readiness Self-Assessment, however, is a place where you take the best practice components listed in the Readiness Checklist and you use them to determine where are we and how can we create where we are to craft some next steps. So the next steps and the questions are going to be used to drive toward the best practice outcomes that are listed on the Readiness Checklist. And when we think about the similarities, both of these documents help districts to determine how ready they are, as well as requiring extensive stakeholder engagement to see if their desired cohort is indeed the correct choice for a district. Now, we're going to take some time to answer this question. We're not together in person, but feel free to pause this recording in order to respond to the question on the screen. How will the changes made to the Readiness Checklist affect how you use it? And just as a reminder, the list of changes that were made to the Readiness Checklist are seen here in this yellow box to the left. So feel free to pause this recording in order to best answer this question. How will the changes made to the Readiness Checklist affect how you use it? After reflecting on this question, we're now going to move into our cohort overview. Currently, when this recording is being recorded, we are well situated within Cohort D. That means that Cohort D's application, which is due on April 15th, 2021, is soon coming. We wanted to provide districts with not only the link for all of the cohort timelines, but we also wanted to provide districts with an overview of what the level of readiness is for each particular cohort. There are some districts that believe they're a Cohort D, might actually be other cohorts. It can be very hard to decipher. So in this example, we're going to look at Eagles ISD, and we're going to help Eagles ISD determine if they are indeed a Cohort D or if they're a Cohort E, F, or G. Keep in mind as I read this example that Cohort D application is due on April 15th, 2021. Also keep in mind that stakeholder engagement best practice should be at least 1 to 2 years prior to application submission. However, please keep in mind that that is best practice. The timeline really depends on district context and needs. Here we go. Eagles ISD superintendent is ready for the district to participate in Cohort D. So he submitted a Cohort D LOI or letter of intent to TEA. Superintendent Peterson wants all teachers to be eligible to earn a designation. So all teachers is the eligible teaching assignment. The district plans to start stakeholder engagement after returning in January 2021. Eagles ISD has no plan to formally train teachers on SLOs, but teachers write their own SLOs as they have done for years, so they feel confident using SLOs as a student growth measure for all teachers. What cohort should Eagles ISD be in? There's a lot of questions we should consider here, but the first is, when is the application due for Cohort D, which we know is April 15th, 2021? How long should effective stakeholder engagement be, at least in best practice terms? And we know that stakeholder engagement, or the process of engaging stakeholders, should take 1 to 2 years, and that's best practice. Of course, there are some times where adjustments need to be made, such as with Cohort D. We also know that there should be training that teachers receive on their student growth measure. We also know that all eligible teaching assignments must have a valid and reliable student growth measure. So let's take a moment and examine Eagles ISD. So we see that the superintendent wanted Eagles ISD to be a Cohort D, and that they wanted to use all eligible, or all teachers, as the eligible teaching assignment. So that means that all teachers in the district must have a student growth measure and must follow statute related to teacher observation. We see that they're returning in January 2021 and starting stakeholder engagement then. We know that best practice indicates it should be at least 1 to 2 years prior to submitting an application. However, we know that there are adjustments that can be made and that we have to consider the context of the district. But 4 months does not seem like a long enough time for a district to do successful stakeholder engagement prior to submitting an application, especially when there's no formal training on the student growth measure that's going to be used. We know that we have a resource in texasslo.org, which helps to provide information on SLOs. However, there's no training that's happening in Eagles ISD. So when we put all of these things into context, not just one sentence or one part, when we put all of the components of this example into context, we see that Eagles ISD should probably consider Cohort E or later. As noted, best practice indicates that districts should have at least 1 to 2 years of stakeholder engagement prior to starting their application. Again, this is just a best practice, so there are some contextual adjustments that can be made depending on district context. We also know that it is very important that teachers and campus leaders are on board and were engaged throughout the process. Doing so in 4 months would make it incredibly challenging, although not impossible, but we do strongly encourage best practice, especially when engaging stakeholders. The purpose of that example was to help us in identifying what are some potential ways that a district can ensure that they are in the correct cohort, even if the desired cohort does not line up with what cohort they should actually be in. It is completely up to a district which cohort they apply for. We just want to provide the appropriate resources for districts to make the best possible choice for themselves. The next part of this presentation is about the Cohort Readiness Self-Assessment Guide. We're going to get to use it, everyone. That's so exciting. Please take a moment by visiting our website, www.tiatexas.org, to access the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide. Once you have the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide handy, we're going to use it in order to complete our work time. I am going to demonstrate for you via a model how you can use this self-assessment guide in order to craft your district's local context, questions, and next steps for your district. The first part that we're going to do together is determining the district context. There are three really important components to discovering the district context. And in order for us to be successful here, we're going to need to look at what the success criteria states. So the very first thing that we need to do is to look at each component of the success criteria. For example, in the success factor 1 rationale, there are three components. So line by line, we're going to determine where is the district in relation to this success criteria. The second thing that we're going to do is to compare the district's current state of each point line by line, and then we're going to measure it up against the success criteria that we see. And we're going to do this almost as if we're using the success criteria as a barometer for where the district context should be. So when you think about the district context and the success criteria, I want you to think of it as a barometer in order for us to determine how ready they are for each of the success criteria mentioned. Let's give an example here. So this is the context for Giants County Schools. This is a sample district, not real, by the way. The context reads that Giants County Schools created their own district version of a teacher observation rubric. So they're not using t-test, not using an IET TAP or any sort of normed rubric. They created their own. The district also created a scope and sequence for appraisers to calibrate yearly according to this district created rubric. Okay. And then teacher appraisers are recertified every 3 years by the district and ESC partners. So you calibrate yearly. You are getting recertified as an appraiser every 3 years, and the district has its own teacher observation rubric that they created. That's the context. And just to be clear, I am using just one key practice within Success Factor 4 as a model. This is just part of a success factor. It does not paint the entire picture of Success Factor 4, which is strongly calibrated teacher observation system. But for the sake of this presentation, I'm just taking one component to demonstrate what you'll do holistically using the entire readiness checklist self-assessment. So now that I have my district context, I need to determine the level of readiness. And there are 3 different levels of readiness. The first is green, which means that the success criteria is in place. The second is yellow, which means that there are some adjustments that are needed. And the third is red, which means that there are many or significant criteria adjustments that are needed or some that are missing. Okay. Before we begin, I want to note that throughout this model, as well as throughout other parts of the presentation, you will see that we are analyzing one key practice within a success factor. Please note that there are multiple key practices within a success factor on the readiness checklist and the readiness self-assessment guide. However, for the sake of this presentation, we're just focusing on one key practice within a success factor in order to illustrate the steps that you will take when analyzing all key practices. So we're just picking a couple of key practices for each different section that we're modeling in order to demonstrate exactly what you're going to do when you are determining the context, the self-assess green, yellow, red, the questions, and the next steps for your specific context. Okay. With that said, let's begin the model. So here you see that Giants County Schools has their own district version of a teacher observation rubric. So if you look at the success criteria, the first bullet indicates that a district needs to use a state-approved or nationally recognized rubric, such as T-Test, Marzano, Danielson, or an IET, and they can also use a rubric that is aligned to T-Test. However, if you look at the context, all Giants County Schools indicated is that they are using their own district-created teacher observation rubric. So we know it's not T-Test, we know it's not Marzano, we know it's not Danielson or NIET. However, we do not know if it is aligned to T-Test or not. So right now, that's an indication that it is yellow because we have no indication as to whether or not their district-created rubric is aligned to T-Test. Now let's move down to the second bullet under success criteria. It states that the district completed a crosswalk between the district-created rubric and T-Test if a district-created rubric is used. And the third bullet underneath the success criteria states that if a district-created rubric is used, the district used the link here for the rubric crosswalk document. So looking at the first bullet under context, we know that there is a district-created rubric that's used. We do not know if it was aligned to T-Test or not, and by our indication, it seems like it's not because the district did not list it in their context. And since a T-Test alignment is not proven based on the context, that means that they most likely did not use the link, which is available here for the district crosswalk document. So far it is yellow because we know that a rubric is used, right? So it would be red if no rubric was used. However, we do know that Giants County Schools is using their own rubric. We just don't know how aligned or not it is to T-Test. Okay, now let's look at the last two bullets underneath the success criteria for key practice A, teacher observation rubric, and appraiser certification. It states that a district has to certify appraisers at least every 3 years, and the district has a clear plan to recalibrate yearly. So let's look at our context. If we look at Giants County Schools context, we see that the district has a scope and sequence so that they can calibrate yearly, which does align to the success criteria. So that is green, right? The success criteria for certifying appraisers is every 3 years, and the success criteria for calibrating is every year. And that does match the success criteria and the context. So that's green. However, the majority of the success criteria and context is yellow because they do not exactly match. We know that Giants County Schools has their own observation rubric. However, we do not believe that it is aligned to T-Test because there's no evidence of that in the context. So that's yellow. And it's Green, when it is in regard to calibration and recertification because the years match. So our previous slide, we indicated that the level of readiness was yellow. And the reason why the level of readiness is yellow is because the majority of the points listed under context and success factor didn't quite match, right? They were almost there. For example, the district did have a district-created rubric, but they didn't align it to t-test. And even though the calibration and certification years did line up between the success criteria and the context for Giants County schools, we did not have more green than yellow, so that meant that the self-assess was yellow. Now, regarding our questions, there are two very important points to consider when crafting questions for a district's Readiness Self-Assessment Guide. The first point is whether the district context, level of implementation, and success factors are aligned. So we have to think, what in the success factor is missing that would warrant me creating a question in order to get an answer for the thing that's missing? So we have to put together what's missing and what is in the district context in order to create questions to come up with next steps for the district. On the next slide, I am going to model what this looks like. Before we begin, I want to note that there are multiple key practices within a success factor. However, for the sake of the model and work time, we will be focusing on one success factor and one key practice within a success factor. Please note that although there are multiple key practices within a success factor, we're going to ensure that we understand how we can actually come up with context, questions, next steps, and self-assess with green, yellow, and red just for one. And then once we can apply that skill to one key practice, we can do so with multiple. Now, onto our model. As you see, the success criteria and context are really important in order to determine what the self-assess or green, yellow, red, or level of implementation is for each key practice. Looking at the success criteria, the first bullet indicates that the district selects a state-approved or nationally recognized rubric such as t-test, Marzano, Danielson, NIET, or another rubric that is aligned to t-test. Moving over to our district context, we see that Giants County School created their own district version of a teacher observation rubric. So there is no indication that Giants County School aligned their teacher observation rubric to t-test using the teacher observation rubric crosswalk that's made available here on this slide. So one of the questions that we can determine based on Giants County Schools not having t-test alignment to their rubric is asking, how will the district ensure that there is alignment to the rubric, focusing on the two statutes that you see listed under the first question. As our question points from the previous slide indicate, we must look at the success criteria and the context to see what is missing, and then we'll put what is missing in question form. So we want to indicate here that the teacher observation rubric for Giants County Schools is not in alignment with t-test. Thus, one of the questions to push our thinking, or to push district's thinking, is to make sure that the teacher observation rubric is aligned to T-test. Another question, as listed under number 2, is what calibration strategies or activities will the district use to ensure teacher appraisers are normed on teacher observation scores with evidence? This is a great question because within the success criteria, we see that the district has to have a clear plan in order to recalibrate and to certify appraisers. However, the plan isn't exactly clear in the context section. So to take this a step further and to turn that yellow into green, one thing that we can do is to get very clear on what the calibration strategies or activities actually are. And the last question, who will the district partner with to support with training, calibration, and recertification? It is super clear that the context for Giants County schools is aligned to the success criteria where recertification and calibration are concerned. However, what is not as clear is who's going to support. Sometimes when we think about some districts across the state, they may want to partner with ESCs or an outside vendor in order to support with their local teacher designation system. So asking this question encourages districts to think about who are your partners in this work and whose assets can you leverage in order to strengthen your system. And as a reminder, this is still yellow because the success criteria, questions, and context do not line up perfectly. Our next focus is on the next steps. So we've spoken about the success criteria. We've determined that the level of readiness is yellow. We created our district context and came up with questions based on that context. But now we need to look at next steps. We can use the success criteria in order to determine what the next steps are. If the success criteria is not mapped out clearly in the next steps, we can take the success criteria points and turn them into concrete, actionable moves that a district can make to improve their system. Here, we've gone over the success criteria, the context, and the questions. Another way to think about the next steps is that they can be answers to the questions. So if we look at the first question, how will the district ensure that the district created rubric aligns to statute 21.351 and 21.352? The next step can be a response to that question. For example, Giants County Schools' next step is to use the rubric crosswalk that is linked in the readiness checklist. That way, the district created rubric can align to nationally normed rubrics such as T-test. Another next step could be to create beginning of the year district-wide calibration protocols so that we can have some clear strategies and they're normed across stakeholder groups so that everyone is aware of what to expect. Our last next step is that recertification is required every 3 years and calibration is required yearly. So we just need to make sure that the requirements are being met in order for your system to be successful. There are other next steps and other questions that you can come up with based on Giants County Schools context and the success criteria for this particular key practice. Feel free to pause this presentation to determine what other next steps and or questions you can come up with. Now that I have shown you how to craft a district context, come up with questions, as well as next steps, In addition to determining the level of readiness using green, yellow, and red, it's time for some work time. We're going to use the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide in order to practice identifying district context, level of readiness using green, yellow, red, questions and next steps for Falcons ISD. We're going to start with identifying the level of readiness using green, yellow, red by looking at the success criteria and district context. Let's begin with a note. As a reminder, this is just one key practice within Success Factor 5. The level of readiness, or green, yellow, red, for this particular key practice does not impact the level of readiness for other key practices within the success factor and others. This is just one key practice within a success factor in order for us to practice exactly how we can identify the level of readiness, district context, questions, and next steps for all key practices within all success factors. Now let's begin. The success criteria, point number 1, indicates that a valid and reliable student growth measure is included as part of a teacher's annual effectiveness rating. It is clear under district context for Falcons ISD that all of their teachers, except for fine arts and world languages, are using a district-created pre-test, post-test with teacher input. So, all eligible teachers, except for fine arts and world languages, have a valid and reliable student growth measure. However, we have to think, what is a valid and reliable student growth measure for fine arts and world languages? If we look at the third bullet underneath district context, it reads, the DSDC, or the District System Development Committee, determined that fine arts and world language teachers would only have teacher observations and not a student growth measure. This is a huge red flag because we know that all eligible teaching assignments must have teacher observation and student growth data. And there is no way to have student growth data if you do not use a student growth measure for an eligible teaching assignment. It is with that understanding that we can determine that Falcons ISD is red. Falcons ISD is red because we know that Falcons ISD does not have a student growth measure for all eligible teaching assignments. So using the success criteria, the self-assess, district context, questions, and next steps, we must determine how we can best support Falcons ISD. We responded to this question, what is the level of readiness for Falcons ISD? And we're going to explain our rationale. Even though there are other components of the district context that are not red, what makes Falcons ISD automatically red with the level of readiness is because not all eligible teaching assignments has a student growth measure. That is required in statute, so it automatically indicates that this particular key practice is red. Although there are other components within the district context, because the District System Development Committee determined that there would only be teacher observation and not student growth measure for fine arts and world language teachers, there is no need to move further in determining what the other components would be. In order for Falcons ISD to move from being red to green, there are some key critical next steps and questions to ask for improvement. We have to ask ourselves, what are those next questions that we would ask this district, and what are the next steps that we would assign? If we look at questions, we can see who is going to create and approve the district-created pre-test, post-test. As mentioned, all teachers except fine arts and world language teachers are using a district-created pre-test, post-test with teacher input. But who's the one creating the actual pre-test, post-test and approving the actual pre-test, post-test? It says that teachers have input, but does that mean that principals are creating the test? Is there a district academics team that's creating the test? Is the superintendent or assistant superintendent creating the test? We can ask that key question to help the district hone in who the key stakeholders are in crafting and approving this district-created pre-test, post-test. I've decided to break up questions 1 and 2 from who is going to create and approve the district-created pre-test, post-test to what role, if any, will teachers play. We see that teachers provide input, but what does this look like? Are some lead teachers actually going to help to create it? Is that their input? Are they reviewing the test before giving it to students? Is that their input? We can get a little more specific here in determining the role of the teacher. Another question is, what is the rationale for using a district-created pre-test, post-test for all teachers except fine arts and world languages? Why do fine arts and world language teachers not have a student growth measure? Is it because there are some district challenges with creating a test for fine arts and world language teachers? Is it because there are very few content experts for fine arts and world languages? Is it more challenging to assess fine arts and world languages than other tested subjects? There are lots of different responses to this question, but asking it will help us to hone in what some key critical next steps can be for all eligible teaching assignments, including fine arts and world languages. The final question is, what student growth measure will be used for fine arts and world language teachers? We know that all eligible teaching assignments are required to have both teacher observation and student growth data. So we must determine what student growth measure can be used for fine arts and world language teachers in order for Falcons ISD to move from red into green. As mentioned before, in order to craft next steps, we can do one of two things. We can look at the success criteria and drag over exactly what we want based on the success criteria. For example, we can look at the first bullet under success criteria. A valid and reliable student growth measure is included as a part of a teacher's annual effectiveness rating. So we can reword that a bit and drag it over into next step by saying, ensure that a valid and reliable student growth measure is included as a part of the teacher's annual effectiveness rating. If we're not going to do it word for word, we can look at the questions column and type a response to the question that we put. For example, the second question indicates, what role, if any, will teachers play? The next step, or the response to that question, is district content experts create a pre-post rubric with teacher input. So we know now that the role of the teacher is to give feedback on the pre-test, post-test rubric that district content experts create. Another question beneath what role, if any, will teachers play is what is the rationale for using a district-created pretest post-test for all teachers except fine arts and world languages? So we know, based on the next steps, that one of the responses could be to have at least one fine arts and world language teachers on the district system development committee. That way, this person can provide rationale or to provide input on the perspective of fine arts and world language teachers so that there can be a clear understanding why there is a student growth measure used for all eligible teaching assignments except for fine arts and world languages. You can also create focus groups, including fine arts and world language teachers, to provide input on what student growth measure is used. And you can use that input as your rationale to determine the valid and reliable student growth measure used for all eligible teaching assignments, including fine arts and world language teachers. Now that we have provided 2 examples on how to craft a district context, level of readiness, questions, and next steps, you can take some time to use the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide to do this for your district. These tools, such as the Readiness Self-Assessment Guide and the Readiness Checklist, are available for you to use by downloading them from our website, www.tiatexas.org. These resources are going to help you in determining exactly what your district should do in order to have a successful local teacher designation system. As you download these tools, please be mindful that your context, level of readiness, questions, and next steps are, as the first bullet indicates, specific to your district context. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or need support in determining how to best use this tool. We sincerely hope that this presentation was helpful and useful for you in order to better support and craft your next steps and your questions for your district's local context. We want to thank you for your participation and for watching this training. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to us at tia@tea.texas.gov. You can also feel free to browse our website for its many resources at tiatexas.org. Thank you so much for your time. Take care.